Buongiorno and welcome back to the broadcast. My name is Naj and we made it to another year full of pandemic contagion, which has resulted in a government full of shame, storms oddly personified with human names, and of course an abundance of video games. We've had some stinkers, some bangers, some shocks, some delights, and I thought I would throw in my penny of thought to the highs and lows of 2021. Now I'm not going to list a load of top 10 lists, I'm just going to keep it short and sweet with my 3 favourite games of the year and my top 3 disappointing ones. And remember, this is all just my opinion and I have picked these games based on my personal feeling when playing them and the ones that have stuck in my mind as the most memorable, whether that be a good thing or not. And of course I haven't played every single game that released this year because man's gotta go to work, but I think more games have entered the realm of my ever-growing backlog than I've actually played this year. But if your choices aren't on the list, then let me know what they are in the comments below, subscribe to the channel to see more, and without any further ado, let's begin. Speaking of doo-doo, I had high hopes at the start of the year when Bloober Team released The Medium. Promoted as the first real next-generation game releasing as a console exclusive to the new Xbox series of consoles, The Medium inspired hope in me that it would at least utilise the capabilities of the newer hardware and that we would quite literally be playing 2 versions of one game simultaneously. However, the reality really was something far duller. A psychological horror game without any real horror aside from a number of technical issues including a frame rate even a slow motion slug would struggle to get along with. That aside, the game really just lacked any real creativity in its use of dual reality gameplay, that it felt more like a gimmick than an evolution in gaming mechanics. The puzzles were simplistic, the exploration a chore. Outside of a small handful of moments, the whole split screen and diving between 2 worlds just felt more aesthetically pleasing as opposed to the intended fresh and exciting gameplay. It's not all bad as it did have an engaging story, characters and a somewhat genuinely creepy antagonist, all of which kept me hooked throughout my roughly 8 to 10 hour playthrough, but it just wasn't enough to redeem the game's downfalls. Real shame. Moving on to one of my games of the year. Have you ever woken up in a hotel room half naked, thinking of pissed, vision blurred by whatever filth consumed hours before, to wonder what even is the meaning of life? I have. You know what else I did this year? Played Disco Elysium. Now before anyone gets their panties in a twist, yes, Disco Elysium originally released back in 2019, however this year saw the launch of Disco Elysium The Final Cut for PC and consoles. I never played the original version of the game and I'm glad I didn't because this definitive edition for me, I know for a fact, would be the best way to experience this mesmerising game. Inspired by tabletop games and pen and paper RPGs, we take control of a detective in what is perhaps one of the best examples I have ever seen of a build your own character, story and ultimately destiny in a video game. Taking place in this lush water painting steampunk cesspool of a city with enough dice rolls and dungeon masters to create what feels like a detective D&D campaign. You have various skills and characteristic trees, all of which are personified within the mind of the protagonist. A protagonist that you can shape however you want. Want to be a stand-up role model cop? Do it. Want to be an alcoholic cop taking bribes to afford more booze and whatever else? Sure. Want to forget you were ever a cop entirely and dive into some deeper spiritual meaning in this Twin Peaks-esque world? Go on in. The core plot of the game is to solve the murder of a recently discovered body, complete with investigations, interrogations, building relationships with the locals and destroying them, all whilst discovering who you really are as a cop suffering with amnesia, with many side quests including scoring a bag of crack for a 12-year-old boy.
A baggie? But like in this vial?
That's half a gram, sir.
Yeah, it's bizarre. On the surface it may seem like a simple RPG with a few dice rolls to determine your next moves, but this is like describing Mein Kampf as some book written by some mental geezer. The quest lines, the complexity, and very important choices to be made in the various skill trees, the way everything can just go so wrong or right depending on your own choices, that I implore everyone to stick with, really unfold a game like no other. The best added feature to The Final Cut is that it is fully voice acted. The game's initial launch wasn't, and there is a monumental amount of dialogue in this game, and that, to be honest, had I played the original, I don't think I would have liked it as much as I did with this version. Not because I can't read, but because the voice acting in this year's launch is so spot on that it adds a whole other layer of immersion.
An excellent opportunity presents itself, sire. You could win the trust of the arch-liar, pretend to play into his hand. Then, should you wish, bend his efforts towards your own.
The various voices detailing your actions and choices suck you in with both their comedic touches and dark sinister tones, creating a package that I would describe as hauntingly chaotic and beautiful. Fantastic stuff, highly recommended.
Let him go!
Lena?
I said no!
Disappointing game number 2, and let me explain something. These are my disappointing games of the year, which doesn't necessarily mean they're bad. In fact, this next entry on my list, Resident Evil Village, is a very good game. I praised it quite a bit back when it launched, as seen in my review. However, as time has gone by, my thoughts on the game have turned slightly, and when thinking about it now, the disappointment kinda does, unfortunately, outweigh my positive thoughts on the game, as I found with each compliment I pay it, a negative spawns from it like some kind of viral infection.
That's not good.
I absolutely adored Resident Evil 7, I thought it was a fantastic revival of the series, and whilst it did in some ways feel like it was holding back, it went old school in that it revisited the franchise's survival horror roots, something that was well needed after the previous few entries being a little too action heavy, and I think that's a pretty big understatement. Resident Evil Village was an opportunity to take what made Resident Evil 7 so fresh and nostalgic at the time, and vamp it up to 11, which Capcom absolutely did, having impacts for me both positively and negatively. My biggest issue with it was the pacing, and not that it was too slow or boring. In fact, it was a blast, yet I felt like something was missing due to the incredibly fast-paced nature of the game. Resident Evil 7 was a slow-burning horror experience, whereas this is a rapid carnival of horrors, without really much horror. If Resident Evil 7 was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, then Resident Evil 8 was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. The Gothic locations were a joy to explore, but you were in and out, like the in-laws dropping off the Christmas prezzies and getting the boot before the turkey was stuffed. Lady Dimitrescu was held up as the next Mr. X or Nemesis, but she had no more than 30 minutes of screen time. The entire squad of Big Bad Four Lords had interesting premises, but that's all they really were, as the levels they resided in were over way too quickly that it was hard to appreciate each fleeting moment, no matter how good that moment was. The enemy variety was vastly improved upon Resident Evil 7, going from the repetitive moulded to a variety of folklore and gothic inspired creatures from werewolves to swamp monsters, thrown at you in the more aggressive style of Resident Evil 4, but none of it was really that memorable like said Resi 4, and it felt more like it was trying to relive that game as opposed to being its own thing. Which I mentioned in my review as something it pulled off well, but as time's gone by it just wasn't as memorable as that game was. Big spoilers here, so you might want to skip to the next one if you haven't played Resi 8 yet, but I enjoyed the story here and the connections to the previous Resident Evil games, but it was all just a bit predictable. For a series trying to advance itself, it keeps on being pulled back by its past successes in favour of fan service. Chris Redfield, a fan favourite character who was, like Lady Dimitrescu, promoted as a villain in this game, killing Ethan's wife and kidnapping his baby. Yeah, we probably all knew it likely wasn't what meets the eye, but there wasn't really any creative reveal to his motives other than just simply confirming in dialogue what the player suspected all along. And then we have the ending itself. A great twist that I, to be honest, didn't see coming, but one that made sense considering how immortal Ethan's hands are. Ethan has been dead since the start of Resident Evil 7, and being himself a moulded shocked me, but it all results in him sacrificing himself to save his child. I mean, fair one. But then this results in your typical "I will avenge you" Chris Redfield moment. These new games, which are supposedly going to be a trilogy, are meant to be the Winter's Bloodline storyline, which I'm sure we will see more of with Ethan's daughter in the upcoming installment, if it's ever confirmed, but it all just comes back to good old Chris. It just felt to me that rather than advancing the story and passing the torch from the old to the new, it's stuck in its old ways. I know some people have a difference of opinion on this and never really liked Ethan as a character, but I wanted something more from his existence within the overarching Resident Evil lore, and here it kinda just straddles the middle. Either go with it or stick with the classics. I mean, how many more times can Chris save the day and end up being the centre of it all? He's had more redesigns than Caitlyn Jenner, but eventually time and hip replacements will catch up. Like I said, a fun game, but a conflicting one that ultimately left a bitter taste in my mouth. Now, this is probably the most surprising game on my list for me, and to be honest, it almost never made it, being replaced by Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, another game that took me by surprise, but looking back, this one had much more of an impact on me. Like many players, I'm sure I played this during lockdown with my girlfriend, someone who doesn't really get video games nor appreciates them like I do, but I was able to get her to play through this entire thing, and the whole experience was quite profound and resulted in one of the most memorable couch co-op experiences I have ever had. Venturing through the trials and tribulations of a divorcing couple who have been turned into small dolls by a magical wish from their daughter, because that's just how it works, was quite difficult when only 50% of the players could actually double tap X to jump without putting too much brain power into it. But over the course of the game, I witnessed our communication, skills and patience develop alongside each other to finally master the game. Now this is of course my experience with it, which is an experience that is very specific to my circumstances, so what about the game with that factor aside? It's great. The level design, the gameplay mechanics, the boss fights, even the story, it was so varied that nothing ever grew stale, and it kept it fresh by flipping the game on its head every time I thought I knew what was coming. One minute it's a third-person shooter, the next a Diablo-style hack and slash. One minute a comedy, the next an emotional roller coaster like it's up there with the best Pixar movies. There is a phrase, the jack of all trades but a master of none, but that didn't really apply here as each level was meticulously designed, and just as I thought I'd seen it all, it kept on surprising me, and was always giving each player something creative to do, and rarely the same thing which adds replayability to the game by swapping characters on a second playthrough. Whilst I do believe the story may not hit home with a couple of friends playing the game, as opposed to a couple, it does offer enough across the board regardless that I can easily recommend It Takes Two to all. Do you ever feel like you live on a different planet to everyone else? Deathloop on launch was praised as one of the best things since Sliced Halloumi. 10 out of 10 here, 5 stars there, Game of the Year from multiple publications. Whatever version they played, I want, because my experience with Deathloop is not a 10 out of 10 game by a long shot. Is it a good game? Yeah, kind of. It's alright. A timed PS5 exclusive that builds its foundation on the concept of time loops, you play as Colt in the main campaign, a renegade member of a visionary group called the Visionaries, who have inhabited an island and are living their best lives over and over again, living literally the same day again and again. Think Groundhog Day crossed with Hitman and James Bond, although Austin Powers may be more appropriate. The concept of the game is something that appealed to me greatly and I was extremely excited for the release, so perhaps part of my disappointment is my own doing with how much I hyped this game up in my own head. The goal is to break the time loop, and to do so we must kill 8 visionaries in a single loop or day. The idea is to learn routines, patterns, relationships and motives of each of the visionaries, so on each subsequent run you get that little closer to killing them all. For instance, disrupting the experiments of one visionary at a certain time of the day will then cause that target to go to a party at night, giving you the opportunity to take out multiple targets in one sweep. Very fascinating, and the possibilities seem endless, but that is just the thing, seem being the key word. I couldn't help but feel there isn't much choice at all, and that, well, what Deathloop gave me is the illusion of choice, which I guess you could argue is all games ever do as programs that prompt us for inputs, but when your selling point and core premise of the game is player choice, then I guess I'd expect there to be more than one way to accomplish your mission. Deathloop was far more linear than I was anticipating, that it did eventually result in following objective markers for various different tasks that needed completing to get to your target. These can be done in any order and with some creativity in how you do them, to the extent of which weapons, powers and upgrades you use and how to navigate the maps, but they all essentially get the same result. I never felt I was in control of the outcomes, and I was just getting more competent at killing the same targets in the same ways, whilst discovering little secrets and quicker ways to get there. But all of the ideas in taking out the targets were never my own. Everything was pretty much given to me on a silver platter, and my own player intervention seemed quite irrelevant. I could have perhaps forgiven this had I enjoyed the combat and the creativity that offered with taking out the trash, but this game was messier than Eton. Hear me now, I played this game at launch, so some of these issues will likely be resolved with patches, which is a phrase that's thrown around way too much. But yeah, my experience may be different to yours if you are playing this now, but if a game makes me actually write something in the report your error box after the third hard crash of the day, then I'm sorry, this is not a 10 out of 10 product. Glitches and bugs, enemy AI that has less IQ than a fucking carrot, I can't believe this game was released in the state that it was. And technical issues aside, this game for me just wasn't all that engaging after a good few hours with it. 16 levels that are essentially 4 levels during 4 different times of day, I found the combat to be clunky, with the idea of variety being planted into your mind early on, to only realise I was just doing the same thing over and over. Yeah, ironic, I know, for a game about time loops, which is also the whole point, but it generally was the same from a gameplay perspective for me. There are only a few weapons in the game, from 2 different shotguns, a nail gun, a couple of rifles and some automatic pistols. Granted, they have different buffs on them, making some unique, and you can implement traits to give different bonuses, but I'd have liked more choice from the selection of core weapons. There are 5 abilities to collect from visionaries in the game, all with various levels of upgrades. However, the game is hurt considerably by only allowing you to take 2 powers on a run. Depending on whether you want to Sam Fisher or Doom Guy, it will determine which abilities are best to take, but to be honest, for my ability I would always take the dash ability because the game felt somewhat unnatural without it, which leaves me with only 1 slot left. I wanted to experiment with a variety of them, but I felt the best experimentation was impossible due to the loadout limitations. And for a game about time, there is a severe lack of powers relating to it. The game is all about repetition and time loops, yet there are no powers that take advantage of that. I remember a game called Time Shift, not the best game, but the powers with regards to the time were pretty unique. I expected some of that here, and it was a missed opportunity. I do feel Deathloop is more accessible than the Dishonored games, Arkane's previous titles, however that doesn't necessarily mean better. A real shame, because I love the setting, the aesthetic design and the idea of it. However, having played the game, I still feel the best of Deathloop is just that, an idea. And I've just bashed in a game in which its main premise is repetition, and now I'm about to kiss one's tushy. Returnal is the best game of the year. Unlike Deathloop, Returnal's repetition is something I felt to be deeply rewarding and far more engrossing from a gameplay perspective. In fact, this game was constantly firing on all cylinders. The first PS5 exclusive that I would say is worth a damn calling a next-gen game. For me, it wasn't just graphics, or the new controller features, or just one new gameplay feature. It was the entire package that created such an immersive and addictive game. Taking place on a mysterious shape-shifting alien planet, we play as Celine, who crash lands on this beautiful shitty rock. Our goal is to find the source of a signal and escape, over and over again, because if Celine dies, we are sent back to the crash site starting from the beginning, in true roguelike fashion. A third-person shooter that requires player patience and determination, and a game that uses the formula of repetition to its advantages, unlike another game I know. What I love about the game is that each run feels fresh and unique despite playing through the same biomes, thanks to the fantastic variety of weapons, character upgrades and abilities, and the assortment of dangerous and horrifying foes, all of which is procedurally generated, meaning each run is engaging thanks to the random nature of it all. The game is very difficult, and the luck of each run really can make or break not only your attempt to the finish line, but your sanity also. But the king on the top of the castle is the gunplay. Fast-paced action that has you dashing and grappling across the levels, manoeuvring through the bullet-hell combat is an absolute joy, filled with breath-holding moments, especially those panic-inducing boss battles. Everything is just so fresh and incredibly smooth and strategic. Every encounter is as intense as the last, and all of this is accompanied by a surprisingly good story, a horror subplot that gives genuine creepy moments, and it's all wrapped up in a gorgeous bow with beautiful graphics and 3D audio that will have you gauging where the enemies are by just the sounds that send shivers through your spine. Not only is this my personal game of the year, I think it's a safe bet to say this is currently the best game on PS5, and I can't wait to see where developer House Marquee takes us next. And that's my games of the year. 2022 looks to have some treats in store, with Elden Ring coming soon, Horizon Forbidden West, God of War Ragnarok, hopefully, fingers crossed, and I'm sure many more. Make sure you stick around by subscribing to the channel as I look to cover some of these upcoming games, as well as a few retro revisits coming up for some old classics. It's gonna be banging.